Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy that you're with us today. I hope you had a good 4th of July, and I hope you had a good barbecue or hot dog and hamburger cookout, whichever it may be. I hope it was all good for you and you got to be with your family and friends. Today we're going to be in session 6, and the title of this session is Proven, and it's taken from 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 25 through 39. So if you don't have it quarterly, you can follow along in your Bible if you like. And you know, a lot of things today, especially with products that we use, they either prove to be good products that do what they say to do, or they're disproved to be really bad products. So, you know, we depend a lot on what's been proven as to whether we trust that or not. Well, you know, the Bible is filled with demonstrations of God's power. And Elijah was an instrument who God used to display his power. We see today that God's past actions assures us of his present and future power. So we know that God's got a proven track record. It's been proven time and time again. So that's what the story is about today. So let's go on into understanding the context, and we're going to go back to 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 24 through chapter 18, verse through 46. Now, 1 King details the reigns of the early kings of Israel and Judea. Omri, who had been a military commander, became the 7th king of the northern kingdom, and that was after the kingdoms had divided. This was the 7th king. Now, his reign was marked by peace and prosperity. He established Samaria as Israel's new capital city, but he promoted the worship of false gods, of idols, if you will. So he was more evil than the kings who had come before him. Now, it's hard to imagine that they had peace and prosperity, and yet he was an evil king. And we can see that he was married. After his death, his son Ahab ruled Israel. And Ahab was married to a Baal worshiper named Jezebel. And I know you've all read the story about Jezebel and what she did. And part of Jezebel's goal was to make Baalism Israel's official religion. And to make that happen, she slaughtered many prophets of God, but not all of them, as we'll find out later on. Now, in chapter 17, we're introduced to Elijah. Now, Elijah announced to King Ahab that Israel would have no rain or dew until the prophet commanded otherwise. You know, the Israelites believed that God showed favor, blessed them, and there would be plenty of water and dew. If he was angry with them, they wouldn't be that. But you see, they were into idol worship, so they thought this false god of theirs could do the same thing, so they wasn't too much worried. Now, we also see that what God said held true. The rain, or what Elijah said held true. God stopped the rain and the dew for 3 years. Now, the Baal worshippers believed that their God ruled over the weather, and they controlled the seasons and the vegetation, but this was not so, and we find out why. So after 3 years of drought, God instructed Elijah to go to Ahab with the message that he would send rain. Now, this announcement would have been startling to someone who believed Baal controlled the weather. So Elijah challenged Ahab to call all of Israel together along with the prophets of Baal to meet him on Mount Carmel. Now, we're going to see what happens here. Let's go in to chapter 18, let's do verse 25 first. And the story of this is going to be fertility. See, once everybody was assembled after Ahab had called them all together, Elijah challenged the people to decide between Baal and God. See, the people were silent. They did not want to choose, according to what the Bible tells us. Yet Elijah kept pressing them. He wanted the people to make a decision. So God was pressing them. Elijah was telling them, make a decision. And according to Elijah's instructions, both he and the prophets of Baal were to prepare separate bulls for sacrifices and to place them on a stack of wood, but not light the fire. So Elijah was going to prove a point here. So let's look a little further here in chapter 25, what we're getting out of this. So Elijah instructed the prophets of Baal to choose first which of the two bulls they wanted. Now, when he did that, this allowed them to keep from saying that it was trickery or sorcery or whatever else they might have imagined that it was. So he let them to choose the first bull, and it gave them every chance to pick the right one, or think they picked the right one. Now, Elijah reminded those assembled, and there were a lot of them. There's probably 450 prophets of Baal versus only one prophet of the Lord there at the time. So we can see that there was numerous people there. So let's look at verses 26 through 29 now. So they took the bull that he gave them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, Baal, answer us. But there was no sound, no answer. Then they danced around their altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah mocked them. He said, shout loudly, for he's a god. Maybe he's thinking it over. Maybe he wandered away. Or maybe he's on the road. Perhaps he's sleeping and will wake up. And we can see how much he was mocking their God, okay? They shouted loudly and cut themselves with knives and spears, according to their custom, until blood gushed over them. All afternoon they kept on raving until the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no sound, no one answered, and no one paid attention. So we can see here in these verses that the Baal worshippers prepared the bull for sacrifice. And once all was ready, they began to call on the name of Baal. Baal followers not only wanted fire to fall from heaven and consume the bull, they were expecting it to happen. They knew it was going to happen. So the more they called, guess what? They got no answer. Now, notice the urgency in their voice after a while. You know, they called out to Baal from morning until noon. All morning, all the way up until noon. Afterwards, they danced around the altar they had made. And then Elijah taunted them, and they shouted louder. They cut themselves with knives and spears. Now, when we think of worshipers cutting themselves until blood gushed over them, this is unimaginable to us for today, but that's what happened. They was cutting themselves. Now, finally in verse 29, it summarizes that they kept on raving. The picture is of a progressing frenzy and panic that grew out of ever-increasing desperation. Because there was no sound, no one answered, and no one paid attention to them. We see that the prophets had called, danced, shouted, sliced themselves, and raved in hopes of getting a response for something that did not exist. A false god does not exist. So all their dancing around, all their shouting, all their cutting themselves from morning until evening produced no response at all. Their bull laid on the altar. Now let's look at the preparation here in verses 30 through 35. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near me." So all the people approached him. Then he repaired the Lord's altar that had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel will be your name. And he built an altar with the stones in the name of the Lord. Then he made a trench around the altar, large enough to hold about 4 gallons of water. Next, he arranged the wood, cut up the bull, and placed it on the wood. He said, "Fill 4 water pots with water and pour it on the offering to be burned on the wood." Then he said a second time, and they did it a second time. And then he said a third time, and they did it a third time. So the water ran all around the altar. It even filled the trench with water. Now, you've got a crowd of people that had the number into the thousands. And there were at least 850 prophets, and 450 representing the Baal, and 400 representing the other god that they worshipped, Asherah, plus all the people who had responded to Ahab's summons to Mount Carmel. So there's a lot of people gathered there. They were numerous, all the people. It says all the people. So Eli was standing before a sea of people. And the people approached. He had plenty of witnesses. And he had them standing this close to remove any change that he was doing treachery. He was not doing any trickery or anything. Now Elijah used 12 stones for the altar. Now, these are the 12 tribes of Israel. And we assume that Jezebel had tore down all the altars of worship. So Elijah had to make a new altar because he refused to use the altar that the worshippers of Baal had used. He built a new altar. And this signifies kind of what Moses did when he made the covenant with God, okay? Now, all this further reminded the people of their covenant relationship with the Lord. Elijah twice connected the altar with the name of Yahweh. Now, Elijah's use of Lord pointed back to the covenant God had drawn up with these people's forefathers, and was a current reminder that without the Lord, there would be no Israel. So let's see what Elijah did now. Elijah repaired the altar, and which I said Jezebel probably had likely destroyed as she swept through Israel, killing all the prophets of God. Now, using the repaired altar, Elijah's way of separating the people from Baal. Now, part of Elijah's charge against the Israelites had been that they had attempted to blend the worship of Baal with the worship of God. God's not going to stand for that. The prophet was drawing a line in the sand. The time for the people to choose was at hand. Hence the separate altar. You either worship God or you worship Allah. You can't worship two gods. Now, around the base of the altar, Elijah dug a trench. He prepared the bull for sacrifice, and then he had the people drench both the bull and the bull offering and the wood 3 times. So that thing was soaking wet. And it used enough water to cover the altar and fill the trench also. I mean, remember, he had a trench dug around the altar, and he had to pour 3 times, water on it 3 times. It wet the wood, the bull, and filled the trench. And again, Elijah, here he was removing any chance for people to accuse him of trickery. Now we're going to get to the response of this lesson. Now let's look at verses 36 through 39. At the time for offering the evening sacrifice, the prophet Elijah approached the altar and said, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that at your word I have done all these things. Answer me, Lord. Answer me so that this people will know that you, the Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." Then the Lord's fire fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell face down and said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Now, about 3 in the afternoon, and that was about the time for the first evening sacrifice, and after the wood, the sacrificial bull, the altar, and the ground was drenched with water, Elijah approached the altar. And in his calm demeanor, which stands in stark contrast to the early frenetic actions of the Baal worshippers, Elijah simply spoke to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Now, by using this title, Elijah again was calling the Israelites to recall the covenant relationship God had made with them. Now, Elijah was also reaffirming his personal relationship with God, that he was part of the Lord's covenant people. Now, in its most basic and profound sense, prayer is simply speaking to God and listening to Him. Now, approaching the altar, Elijah presented to God his fivefold request. Okay, now I'm going to run over those 5 requests that he made. That the people would know the Lord, not Baal. He wanted them to know the Lord, the God of Israel. 2, that the people would know Elijah was God's servant. And 3, that the people would realize Elijah had been acting on God's instructions. And 4, that God would answer Elijah's prayer, meaning he would send fire. And 5, that the people would realize the Lord had turned their hearts back, meaning they would have the opportunity to repent. Now, this is a simple prayer Elijah prayed. And it indicates that he was comfortable talking to God. He was a man of prayer. He humbly spoke to the Almighty. 2, the request in no way recalled attention to Elijah. The prophet wanted to make sure that God was the one receiving recognition and honor. And then Elijah said, "Answer me, Lord." And he was confident God would answer. And without that certainty, Elijah would never have gathered the people or prepared the altar. Elijah knew that God would answer him. Elijah's actions reveal what he believed and expected. God would answer. Now, after Elijah's prayer, the Lord's fire fell and consumed the altar and all that was around it. Now, 2 things we want to notice in the people's reaction. First, having seen the demonstration of God's power, they fell face down. Fell face down. See, they could not help but fall face down in awe of God's power. And secondly, they declared that, Lord, He is God. See, those who would not speak earlier could not be silent. Their declaration remains true still today. May we likewise proclaim it boldly. You see, God plainly states and shows in this, there is no other gods. They didn't answer the Israelites. They didn't answer the Baal priest. They wasn't there. But Elijah called on God's power and on fire, and God sent it to show that He is the one true God. Now, the things that we need to pick up from this lesson today is all false gods will lead to disappointment and emptiness. Every one of them. None of them will give you the happiness, the joy that you will have in Jesus Christ. God is honored when we express trust in His power. And God answers the humble prayers of His servants. Now, I hope you enjoyed this lesson today. We've got to see 3 different aspects of it. We've got to see the fertility, the preparation, and then we also got to see the response. All in those verses that we just read and went over. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope to see you in church this Sunday. Until then, God bless you. I hope you have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.